The moment my husband's lawyer looked at me across that courtroom and said, "Your Honor, opposing counsel has no legal standing," I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. My husband sat back in his chair with the kind of smile that belongs on someone who has already won. His mistress was in the gallery, third row, wearing the necklace I had picked out for myself at Nordstrom 2 Christmases ago. I had noticed it the second I walked in. I did not look away from the judge. Let me tell you how I got to that room. My husband and I met at a conference in Austin when I was 26. He was a regional sales director for a medical device company. I was a junior analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm in Dallas. He was charming in the specific way that takes a while to see through, the kind of charming that looks like confidence until you realize it only ever worked in his favor. We dated for 2 years, got married at a venue outside San Antonio, and by the time I was 30, I had quietly folded most of my ambitions into the shape of our life together. I want to be honest about that part. I am not going to pretend I was dragged. I made choices. I turned down a promotion that would have moved me to Chicago. I scaled back my hours when his travel schedule got heavy, because someone had to be home, and he made it clear, without ever saying it plainly, that he did not intend for that someone to be him. We talked about kids and never quite got there. We talked about buying a house and did. A 4-bedroom in Plano with a backyard neither of us used enough. For 7 years, I told myself this was a partnership. I found out it wasn't on a Tuesday. I'd come home early from a client site because a migraine had been building behind my right eye since noon. I let myself into the garage, set my bag on the kitchen counter, and heard his voice upstairs. Low, careful, the kind of voice people use when they are trying not to be overheard in their own house. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then I went up. I'm not going to describe what I saw in detail. You already know what I saw. What I will tell you is that the woman in my bedroom was someone I recognized. She had been to our house before. She had sat at our kitchen table. She had eaten the brisket I smoked for 8 hours for my husband's birthday dinner last March. He saw me in the doorway. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed, the way you look when someone interrupts a meeting you were already invested in. He said my name once, flatly, as if I was the inconvenience. I left the room. I went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen counter for a very long time. When he came down 20 minutes later, his shirt was tucked back in. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter across from me and said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about some things." That sentence, I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count, not because of what it meant, but because of how ordinary it sounded. Like he was about to discuss a cable bill. He told me he wanted a divorce. He told me the house was in his name, which was technically true because we had structured it that way for financing reasons, a decision I had agreed to without a second thought. He told me my income had been inconsistent the past couple of years, which was also technically true because I had taken on fewer billable projects to manage our household. He told me I should think carefully before pursuing anything in court because attorneys were expensive, and I would be throwing money at a process I wasn't going to like the outcome of. Yet she said that. I looked at him across the kitchen island, this man I had spent 7 years building a life with, and I realized he had been doing math on me for a long time. 3 days later, I came home from staying with my sister to find my clothes in garbage bags on the front porch. Not boxes, garbage bags. Black ones. My Vitamix was gone from the kitchen. My grandmother's ceramic serving bowl was gone. When I called him, he sent my call to voicemail. I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I had lived in for 4 years, and I made myself think clearly. Here is what he did not know about me. Before I married him, before I scaled back and settled in, I had spent 3 years as a paralegal at a family law firm in Houston, not because I needed the money, I was already in consulting, but because I had gone through my parents' divorce as a teenager and I had decided at some point that I never wanted to feel as helpless as my mother had felt in that process. I knew family law, not the way a licensed attorney knows it, but enough to know what discovery looked like, what community property statute said in Texas, what a forensic accountant could find in 7 years of joint finances if she knew where to look. I filed for divorce myself. He did not take that seriously at first. His attorney, a man named Garrison who had a billboard on I-75, sent me a letter that was essentially a polite suggestion that I retain counsel before proceeding. I sent back a response citing 3 specific statutes and requesting full financial disclosure under Texas Family Code Section 6.52. Garrison called my husband that same afternoon. I know because my husband called me an hour later, the first time he had voluntarily called me since the porch incident, and he was not using his flat voice anymore. But let me back up, because before the courtroom, there were 3 months. 3 months of me living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Richardson that I found in 48 hours and furnished mostly from Facebook Marketplace. 3 months of my sister driving over on Sundays to sit at my table and not say things like, "I told you so," because she is a good person. 3 months of me going through 7 years of bank statements, tax returns, and credit card records that I had kept meticulous copies of. Because I am a consulting analyst and documentation is a reflex I cannot turn off. What I found was not small. My husband had been running personal expenses through his company account for at least 5 years. A lake house rental in East Texas that appeared in business travel, dinners that showed up as client entertainment. I am not an accountant, but I knew what I was looking at. I brought everything to a CPA who specialized in divorce cases, a woman named Cheryl who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the calm energy of someone who had seen everything. She confirmed what I suspected. The lifestyle we had been living was partially funded by unreported income flowing through his business, and because I had filed joint tax returns with him for 6 years, I had potential exposure. That was the moment things got serious for me, not just the divorce, the whole picture. I contacted a forensic accountant, I contacted a tax attorney, I kept filing my own divorce motions because I had learned enough to manage the procedural side, and because every time I appeared in documents as self-represented, Garrison treated it like a minor obstacle. That was a mistake on Garrison's part. The morning of the hearing, I drove myself to the Collin County courthouse. I wore a navy blazer I had borrowed from my sister and the kind of low heels that say I am here to work. I carried an accordion folder with everything organized by tab. In my experience, the people who are most underestimated in formal settings are the ones who have done the most homework. Garrison was in the hallway when I arrived. He looked at my accordion folder and then at me with an expression that was almost kind. Almost. The kind of almost kind that means someone does not believe they need to take you seriously. My husband was next to him. He was wearing the charcoal suit he saved for important things. He saw me and did not acknowledge me. His girlfriend was there too, which I had not expected. She sat in the gallery in the 3rd row in my Nordstrom necklace, and I looked at her for exactly 2 seconds before I looked at the front of the room. The judge was a woman. Her name was on the docket sheet and I had looked her up before I came. 18 years on the bench, former family law attorney. She had a reputation for not tolerating procedural games. When the hearing opened, Garrison stood up and made a motion to dismiss my financial disclosure requests on the grounds that I had incorrectly cited procedural basis. I had cited Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 196. He argued I should have filed under 194. The difference was narrow enough that I had prepared for exactly this argument. I stood up. I said, "Your Honor, the requests at issue were filed under TRCP 196 because they seek production of documents and tangible things which fall squarely within the scope of that rule. Rule 194 governs requests for disclosure of basic party information, which was completed in the initial filing. If opposing counsel would like to identify the specific subpart of 194 he believes controls here, I would welcome that clarification." There was a pause. Garrison looked to my husband. My husband looked at Garrison. The judge looked at her paperwork. She said, "The motion to dismiss is denied. Miss Holt's requests stand. Counsel, please proceed." Miss Holt. That was me. My maiden name, which I had started using again the week after I moved into the apartment in Richardson. Garrison adjusted his approach after that. He moved to the financial issues. He argued that my husband's business income was separate property and not subject to community division. He presented documentation showing the business had been founded before our marriage. I did not interrupt. I took notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, I stood again. I said, "Your Honor, the business entity was founded 3 years before the marriage. However, the substantial growth of the business, which accounts for approximately 80% of its current value, occurred during the marriage using marital funds and, I would note, significant unpaid labor contribution from the community spouse. I then presented a 3-year period of bank transfers from our joint account to the business operating account, totaling just under $90,000. I presented documentation showing I had handled vendor coordination, client communication, and scheduling for the business for 4 of the 7 years of the marriage, entirely without compensation. Garrison objected. Twice. The judge overruled him, both times. Then I asked permission to raise a separate matter. The judge nodded. I said, Your Honor, in the course of preparing for this proceeding, documentation came to my attention suggesting that a portion of the income reported to this court may not accurately reflect total household earnings over the marriage. I laid the financial summary from Cheryl on the table and walked it to the clerk. I have also provided a copy of this documentation to the IRS whistleblower office as required, and I wanted the court to be aware. The room went quiet in a way I had not heard a room go quiet before. Garrison set down his pen. My husband turned in his seat and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since the kitchen counter. The expression on his face was not anger. It was the specific look of someone realizing they had made a significant miscalculation. His girlfriend in the third row was very still. The judge looked at the summary, looked at Garrison and said, Counsel, I'm going to recommend your client consider his position carefully before we reconvene. She called a 20-minute recess. In the hallway, Garrison found me at the water fountain and said very quietly that his client might be open to a settlement discussion. I said I would be available after lunch. My sister was waiting in the hall outside. She'd driven down from McKinney without me asking. She handed me a granola bar and said nothing, which is exactly what I needed. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. I will not pretend it was everything I deserved, because nothing is ever exactly that. But I walked away with a fair share of the equity in the Plano house. I walked away with documentation that protected me from any future liability on the tax filings. I walked away with a cash settlement that accounted for my unpaid contributions to the business. I also walked away with my grandmother's ceramic bowl. Garrison's client had forgotten to account for personal property in his initial offer, and I had an itemized list of everything that had been in that house, including acquisition dates and estimated values. My husband's attorney did not push back on the bowl. The IRS investigation is ongoing. I do not know what the outcome will be, and that is not mine to control. What I can tell you is that I gave them accurate information and let the process work the way it is supposed to. There are things I think about now on evenings when I am in my apartment in Richardson with the second-hand lamp I actually like better than anything I had in Plano. I think about the version of me who sat at the kitchen counter that Tuesday night and felt completely alone. I want her to know that the alone part was temporary. I want her to know she had more than she thought. Not money, not connections, knowledge, the kind you build quietly over years because something in you decides early that you will not be caught without it. I think about the moment in the courtroom when the judge said my name, not his, and ruled in my favor on the first motion. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp from the gallery. The judge just kept going to the next item on her docket. That is how real justice usually works. Quietly, procedurally, without applause. I am not angry at him anymore. I want to be precise about that. It is not that the anger was wrong. It was just temporary fuel, and I have used it up. What I feel now is mostly clear. I know what I'm worth because I had to calculate it, line item by line item, in a well-lit apartment at 10 o'clock at night with a yellow legal pad and 7 years of bank statements. No one handed me that number. I worked it out myself. And that, I think, is the thing he never accounted for. I keep coming back to that Tuesday, not the bedroom. I've made my peace with that image and what it meant. I keep coming back to the kitchen counter after, when he stood across from me and laid out his math like I was a problem he had already solved. He said the word attorney, the way people say it when they want you to feel the distance between where you are and where you'd need to be. He was counting on that distance. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to find out, was that I had been preparing for that distance for years without knowing it. Not for him, specifically, for the feeling my mother had when she sat across from my father's lawyer at 17 and didn't understand what was being signed away. I had decided, somewhere in my mid-20s, that I would not sit in that chair, So I learned not to be a lawyer, just to not be helpless. That's the thing about knowledge that people underestimate. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in you until the moment it's needed, and then it's there. When I cited Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 196 in that courtroom and Garrison paused, that pause was 7 years of quiet preparation. It was every late night I'd spent at that paralegal desk in Houston reading case files I wasn't required to read. It was the choice to stay curious about how systems work, even when I had no immediate reason to be. And that's the part I want to sit with because I think it matters more than the outcome. The outcome was good. I got the equity, I got the settlement, I got my grandmother's bowl back. But none of that happened because I was lucky or because someone stepped in. It happened because I had done the work, the honest, unglamorous, yellow legal pad at 10 p.m. kind of work, and I had done it with integrity. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't manipulate anything. I handed Cheryl the real records and I told the court the real numbers, including the ones that implicated me on the joint returns. That transparency cost me some comfort in the short term. It also protected me completely in the long term. My husband ran his calculations on a version of me that had stopped growing the day I scaled back my hours. People do that. They take a snapshot of who you are in a moment of compromise, and they decide that's the whole picture. He saw someone who had made herself smaller for the sake of the marriage, and he concluded that smaller was all there was. He was wrong, and the error was his, not mine. My sister drove down from McKinney without me asking her to. She handed me a granola bar in a courthouse hallway and said nothing. That kind of love, steady, practical, without performance, is what gets you through the rooms where everything is on the line. I didn't win because I was alone and strong. I won because I'd been honest with myself about what I knew, what I didn't know, and who I could trust. That combination. A clear conscience, a prepared mind, and the stubbornness to keep going when the other side has a billboard on I-75, turns out to be enough. It's enough. That's what I want to say to anyone sitting at a kitchen counter tonight, trying to do the math on their own situation. You may have more than you think. Not in your bank account, in you.